Hello and welcome. If you are going through a spiritual awakening or are on a spiritual path of some kind, you've probably realized that you and basically all other people have an ego. You've probably also realized that this fact has a huge impact on your life and that, at the same time, the ego is a somewhat elusive concept. Partially, this is due simply to the nature of language, where it is impossible to fully describe a phenomenon in words. But for many, it seems to also be due to the fact that they have not really considered seriously what the ego might be, and tried to discern its mechanisms and how it affects them on a personal level. In his works, David R. Hawkins delves into the complex nature of the ego, its defining qualities, and how it influences one's consciousness and experience of life. By examining Hawkins's ideas on the ego, we gain insight into his perspectives on why the ego acts as it does, how it maintains control, and what it takes to transcend it. Hawkins begins by describing the ego as the constructed self-image, an identity that is built up over time based on beliefs, opinions, fears, and attachments. This identity is something the mind clings to for security, seeing it as a central reference point around which to understand and navigate the world. The ego, in this context, is not a coherent personality, but rather a compilation of thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs shaped by life experiences, cultural conditioning, and personal history that combined give off the illusion of a stable identity. An identity through which one feels separate from others, thus enforcing a limited and often defensive worldview. However, the more we try to locate this separate identity, the more we realize that it is nowhere to be found. It is an illusion, a trick of the mind. And yet, most of us fiercely defend this illusion and all that we perceive as belonging to it. It is enough to observe one's behavior, the behavior of others, and what drives much of the actors on the world stage to see that it is so. Hawkins emphasizes that the ego continuously seeks control, validation, and a sense of superiority. It is a mental construct driven by survival instincts, aiming to assert itself in situations, protect itself from perceived threats, and ensure its continuity. It defines the world in terms of me versus them, or us versus them, creating an endless cycle of judgment, separation, and fear. This reinforces a sense of isolation, where the ego becomes protective and resistant to anything it perceives as a challenge to its validity. The ego, thus, has a constant need for validation, approval, and dominance over others or situations. This drive can cause one to live in a persistent state of defensiveness or comparison, blocking the ability to experience unity, connection, or a sense of inner peace. According to Hawkins, the ego is at the core sustained by pride, desire, and attachment. These are specific words referring to specific inner states, and you are asked to reflect on them, what they mean to you, and how they play out in your life, as it is crucial that you apply what you learn to your own experience. The ego forms beliefs about itself and the world based on external inputs and emotional reactions, then fiercely clings to these beliefs as absolute truths. For example, when one feels hurt or rejected, the ego quickly forms protective mechanisms, deciding that the world is hostile or untrustworthy. Through selective perception, the ego will then find evidence for its beliefs, while ignoring input that may contradict them. It furthermore tries to ensure similar feelings are avoided in the future, leading to patterns of behavior driven by fear, resentment, or anger. These patterns create repeated reactions, where one feels compelled to respond defensively or aggressively to protect the ego's constructed identity. Attachment means that the ego clings to objects, people, or situations as sources of identity and security, creating a dependency on them for self-worth. In this way, the ego drives people to seek fulfillment outside of themselves, in relationships, material possessions, achievements, or social status. This search is insatiable, as the ego always feels incomplete or lacking and constantly seeks more to satisfy itself. None of this suggests that it's wrong to enjoy experiences, possessions, or meaningful relationships. It's when we become attached to these things and believe that we need them in order to be happy that we get caught in the trappings of the ego, which causes us to live in a more or less constant state of varying degrees of dissatisfaction. Something that we touched upon in the beginning is that at the core of Hawkins's view on the ego is its illusory nature. The ego is fundamentally a misidentification of the self. It arises from confusing the mind and body's experiences with one's true nature. According to Hawkins, the self that one seeks to protect, assert, and defend is not real in the ultimate sense. It is a series of thoughts, beliefs, and emotions, none of which define the true self. The true self, Hawkins argues, is beyond the ego's grasp and operates on a higher level of consciousness, where there is no need for validation, fear, or control. This higher self is aligned with peace, love, and compassion, attributes the ego cannot comprehend, because it relies on division, comparison, and judgment. Ultimately, the true self is not an individual identity at all, but simply pure, infinite consciousness that experiences itself subjectively through us. The ego maintains its dominance by creating resistance to change. It sees any shift in identity or perception as a threat, and therefore fights to maintain its existing beliefs and perceptions. Even if these beliefs are harmful or limiting, the ego clings to them because they provide a sense of continuity. Hawkins explains that the ego is inherently resistant to the process of letting go because it interprets surrender as loss or annihilation. For example, if one is used to feeling resentment, the ego becomes attached to this feeling because it reinforces a particular identity. Letting go of resentment would threaten the ego's sense of self, so it resists, often justifying and rationalizing its stance to maintain control. The ego's control is strengthened by what Hawkins describes as positionalities, which are fixed beliefs or positions that the ego adopts. These positions can be related to morality, ideology, social status, or personal success. The ego attaches to these positions as if they are integral to its identity, so any challenge to these beliefs is perceived as a threat. For example, if one's ego is attached to being seen as highly competent, any critique may trigger anger, defensiveness, or denial. This reaction is not due to the critique itself, but rather the ego's attachment to the identity it has built around competence. In this way, the ego creates suffering by insisting on being right, in control, and superior. Again, it might be wise to observe how this plays out in your own life. What kinds of labels, positive or negative, have you constructed an identity around? What comments from other people trigger defensiveness in you? Hawkins highlights that the ego operates on a low level of consciousness because it is primarily motivated by negative emotions like pride, fear, anger, and desire. These emotions create what Hawkins calls low-energy states, where the ego's focus is on survival, validation, and competition. The higher states of consciousness, associated with love, peace, and acceptance, are only accessible when one transcends the ego. The ego, however, cannot reach these states on its own, as it is inherently limited by its attachments, desires, and fears. It requires a shift in perception to see beyond the ego and recognize the limitations of its view. A crucial aspect of overcoming the ego, in Hawkins's view, is the practice of letting go of emotional attachments. As already mentioned, the ego thrives on reactivity, responding with intense emotions to perceived threats or desires. By learning to observe and release these emotions without acting on them, one reduces the ego's influence. For example, if one feels anger or resentment, the ego will likely reinforce these feelings by justifying them or identifying with them. However, by observing the emotions and the thoughts that are connected with it without attaching to any of it, one can see it as a passing reaction rather than a defining part of the self. This practice gradually diminishes the ego's control, allowing a clearer connection to the true self. Hawkins also explains that the ego is sustained by guilt and shame, which keep one locked in a lower state of consciousness. These emotions reinforce the ego's identity by creating a narrative of unworthiness or failure. By keeping one focused on past mistakes or perceived shortcomings, the ego maintains its hold as one becomes entangled in self-judgment and self-pity. To transcend the ego, Hawkins emphasizes the importance of releasing guilt and shame, understanding that these feelings are ego-based distortions that prevent growth. The true self is beyond these feelings, capable of forgiveness and self-acceptance. The ego's attachment to judgment is another barrier Hawkins identifies. The ego is inherently judgmental, constantly evaluating people, situations, and oneself against an internal standard. This judgment is based on comparisons and conditions, reinforcing separation and division. Hawkins suggests that letting go of judgment allows one to experience situations without the ego's biases, leading to a sense of openness and acceptance. Judgment, in this sense, is a reflection of the ego's desire to assert superiority or protect itself. By releasing judgment, one reduces the ego's grip, making room for a broader, more compassionate understanding of oneself and others. The ego, in its need to sustain itself, often creates an illusion of control, where it believes it can dictate the outcomes of situations or relationships. Hawkins points out that this illusion is a significant source of suffering, as the ego is never fully in control, leading to frustration and disappointment. By clinging to control, the ego prevents the natural flow of life, creating resistance that leads to emotional pain. Letting go of the need to control is a step towards liberation from the ego, allowing one to live more freely and harmoniously. Ultimately, Hawkins describes the ego as a block to experiencing the true nature of reality, where love, compassion, and peace are intrinsic. The ego distorts reality by projecting its own fears, desires, and judgments onto the world. This distortion leads to suffering, as the ego's limited perspective cannot perceive the inherent unity and wholeness of existence. By transcending the ego, one is able to see beyond these illusions, experiencing life from a place of genuine connection and contentment. Hawkins's work suggests that the journey beyond the ego is both challenging and transformative. It requires a willingness to let go of long-held beliefs, emotional attachments, and the need for control. By doing so, one gradually dissolves the ego's influence, allowing a deeper awareness to emerge. This awareness is characterized by acceptance, compassion, and a profound sense of peace, qualities that the ego, with its focus on separation and fear, cannot comprehend. In summary, Hawkins views the ego as a false self, an identity constructed by the mind as a way to navigate the world, but ultimately a barrier to true understanding. The ego thrives on division, control, and attachment, keeping one in a cycle of fear, desire, and judgment. Its identity is shaped by beliefs, experiences, and cultural influences, driving a sense of separation from others and fueling a need for validation, superiority, and control. The ego seeks fulfillment and security externally, making it prone to constant dissatisfaction. It sustains itself by clinging to fixed positions and emotional reactions, particularly through pride, fear, and desire, which keep it in a low-energy, survival-focused state. By recognizing the ego's limitations and surrendering its hold, one moves closer to the true self, where the illusions of fear, separation, and inadequacy dissolve, allowing for a state of genuine fulfillment and inner freedom. Through his teachings, Hawkins invites us to explore the nature of the ego, to see its impact on our lives, and to understand the liberation that comes from moving beyond it. Finally, What you are hopefully beginning to discern from what you've listened to is that the ego puts an illusory filter on top of reality in the form of ideas, labels, judgments, opinions, views, etc., and makes us believe that what these filters are telling us is the actual truth. None of these things are real, but our ability to use language and picture abstract concepts gives off the illusion that they are. When you start seeing through this, you begin your journey toward liberation from your ego's wrongful perceptions. You've now reached the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for your time.